All right, friends, you are in for a treat. We are here with Nancy Pearcey, one of the leading Christian writers and thinkers, for a behind the scenes interview. What that means is we're not going to discuss and debate apologetics as we have many times. I'm going to ask Nancy some questions about the people and books and experiences that she's had, just to kind of hear some untold stories about her life and ministry. Nancy teaches at Houston Baptist University, which is a sister school to Biola Apologetics. We love what you're doing over there. You've written a ton of books, and one I definitely want to mention to our viewers to start off with is your book, Love Thy Body. Is just fantastic. We're going to get into some of the reasons you wrote that and the nature of that conversation today, but really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a great, your purpose in this program is really great. I like it a lot.
Well, last year, you and I had a chance to go with a group of apologists to Israel, and you shared some of your faith journey to me that I had never heard before. And I think I've read, all of your books. Maybe I missed it, but would you be willing to share your journey to faith? Because it intersects with Francis Schaeffer and Labrie in a way that's just so interesting.
Oh, yes, I love to talk about my faith journey because it's so important to me, and it has continued to shape the rest of my life. So it's also important for people who read my books to know where I'm coming from. So I grew up in a Lutheran home. I say Lutheran rather than Christian.
Okay.
Because like Italian Catholics, or the ethnicity overrides in some senses, I think, the Christianity. I grew up in a Scandinavian Lutheran home. My father was Swedish, my mother's Norwegian. And I don't know if you know, but the state churches in Scandinavia were all Lutheran. And so and midway through high school, I started asking questions about Christianity. And my parents were just baffled because all they knew was, hey, we're Swedish. What else are you going to be? If not Lutheran. So this was difficult because I was attending a secular, public school where all my teachers were secular, all my textbooks were secular. And I'm asking my parents just one question, really just one question, Sean. I was saying, how do we know Christianity is true? That's all I was asking. How do we know it is true? And my parents couldn't answer that because, like I said, it was more of I think it was more of an ethnic background thing for them. My pastors couldn't answer it. All the adults in my life. I'll give you two examples. So I talked to a Christian university professor, and I said, "How do you know Christianity is true?" The way I put it was, "Why are you a Christian?" And he said, "Works for me."
Wow.
Said,
Wow.
whoa, that's it? That's all you have? And then I had, by the way, he was Lutheran. And then I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, again, Lutheran. And I don't want to put down Lutherans, but they do have this ethnic background. So I talked to a seminary dean and I asked him why he was a Christian. And he said, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes.
Wow.
As though it was a psychological phase that I was going through. And after that, I eventually decided that maybe Christianity just didn't have any answers. And I certainly had no reasons to believe it was true. And this was about halfway through high school. I came to the decision that I would have to reject my Christian background, my Christian upbringing, and try to go on a search for truth, look at all the religions and philosophies of the world that are out there and decide which one was really true. And it was going to be up to me since the adults in my life couldn't answer my questions. So that was a big decision. The upshot was that I very consciously started looking for truth. I started very consciously. That's how I ended up looking at philosophy. It was not an academic interest. It was a very personal interest because I thought, well, who is it? And who is it who talks about questions like, is there meaning to life? Is there a purpose to life? Is there objective foundation for ethics? Or is it just, true for me, true for you? Are we just on a rock flying through space? Well, I pretty quickly realized that if there is no God, then the answer is that no, there is no purpose to life.
Yeah.
No, there is no foundation for ethics. No, we're just on a planet flying through empty space. I was the one in my friend group in high school who was arguing for moral relativism. A friend of mine, for example, a friend of mine said, "Oh, she's so wrong," and I'm the one who jumps in and says, "You can't say anyone's wrong."
Wow.
So I was arguing explicitly for skepticism, and well, skepticism too, because I began to realize, again, I was still in high school. I began to realize if all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and history, how could I expect to know any kind of objective, absolute, universal truth? Ridiculous. And that's how it struck me as a teenager. Ridiculous. Of course I can't know that kind of truth. And so I also went from relativism into skepticism. And by the way, also determinism. I had enough science background to think that we were basically biochemical machines and didn't have any free will anyway. So I pretty rapidly became a total relativist and skeptic. And that's how I ended up at L'Abri, which is the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. So I had several years already of being a very, very much an agnostic.
So at this point, can I jump in? Are you about 18, 19 years old when you go to L'Abri? And is this 80s or when? Just give me a sense of when this might be. I'm not trying to date you, but just get some historical sense.
I know. I was 19. It was 19.
Okay.
I was 19 years old. Okay. What happened is I went to Europe because we had lived there when I was a child.
Okay.
And I loved it. I loved Germany and I wanted to go back. And so I did. I went back and lived with a family, my best friend's family. And so that's how eventually I ended up hearing about L'Abri, which was in Switzerland. And Sean, you're going to laugh about this because people ask me, well, if you were not a Christian by then, why would you go to a Christian ministry?
Sure.
And the answer was, I had some relatives who were stopping at L'Abri. They were driving across the continent to go to the cheap Luxembourg flights. Back then, everyone who went to Europe, took these cheap Luxembourg flights. And so they said, "Listen, we're stopping at this place in Switzerland. Why don't you come down and see us?" So I did not go to L'Abri to go to L'Abri. I went there to see my relatives,
wow,
my family members who were staying there for the weekend, just the weekend. But they had a special discussion group for people who were there, who were short-time visitors. And I don't know if you know this, but back then, a lot of what they studied was taped lectures. L'Abri grew up very organically. It started with Schaeffer giving lectures, and then eventually they started taping the lectures. And then eventually people would be able to come and listen to these taped lectures by both Francis Schaeffer and by Os Guinness and others who were on staff. And so they selected the lectures that they thought showed sort of the core of the L'Abri message for short-term visitors. And I was in that group. And it was very evident that I was not a Christian. And so the L'Abri staff person who was running the lectures said, "We have a free bed. You want to stay?"
Okay.
That's how it was back then. It was very unstructured. Yeah. Today you have to write ahead and, get a reservation a year in advance. But back then, it was, "Hey, we have a free bed. You want to stay?" And I have to tell you, Sean, this is the first time I had ever encountered Christian apologetics. Wow. I had no idea that Christianity could be defended with good reasons and arguments and logic. I had never met, by that time, of course, I was immersed in all kinds of secular philosophies. And I had never met a Christian who could engage with those philosophies. Wow. And the L'Abri staff could, they knew, I have to tell you, they knew my questions better than they did because they were so well read in secular philosophy that they were able to say, okay, for example, I said earlier I was a moral relativist. Do you think I had the term relativism? No. I was just a teenager. I didn't even have the term to describe what I was saying. So I arrive at L'Abri and they say, okay, so you're a moral relativist. Okay, so you're a skeptic. So, okay, you're a determinist. Here are all the good reasons against those positions. I was astonished. I was blown away. I had never encountered Christians like this. And of course, I should also add, because L'Abri was a residential ministry and people actually lived in people's homes, that was another big part of it. Many people who went to L'Abri, including myself, would say that they were equally affected, not just by the apologetics, but also by viewing the kind of the quality of Christian community.
Gotcha.
Experiencing love in a way that we had never experienced it, even in churches back home. That was equally impressive.
Wow.
Because what that meant is it was real, right? It wasn't just a bunch of abstract ideas that sounded good. But these were people who actually lived it out and had a different quality of life. Now, I have to tell you, it was so impressive that I fled.
Are you serious? Wow. Okay.
After only a month, I left.
Oh, wait, you went for the weekend, but you stayed a month, though.
Excuse me. I stayed a month. When they said, you want to stay, I said, okay. I need to find out more about these people. Okay. Oh, I should add another thing. I think you will appreciate this. So Schaeffer was into apologetics. There was the community. There was also the arts, because Schaeffer is well known for having encouraged Christians to go into the arts.
Yeah.
And I was studying at the music conservatory in Heidelberg, Germany. So I was a musician, and so the message of the arts was important to me. But then the final thing was all the students at L'Abri were hippies. This was 1971.
Okay.
And everybody was a hippie. And back then, hippies were the cool kids. And so I was really impressed, because I thought, who are these Christians who are able to reach across the cultural divide and appeal to these disaffected young people? Because back then there were no ministries to hippies. Later there were.
Yeah.
But at that time there were not. There were not any ministries that were able to reach across that cultural divide. So all that to say, I was so impressed that I was afraid I might become a Christian for emotional reasons, because it was so attractive.
Wow.
And I didn't want to do that. Christianity had already let me down once. And I was not going to become a Christian unless I was intellectually convinced it was true.
Wow.
And the internal pressure to make up my mind was so great at L'Abri that after a month I left.
Okay.
And I went back to the States. But because of my time at L'Abri, I discovered that there was such a thing as apologetics. I discovered C.S. Lewis. I discovered G.K. Chesterton, all these people. And of course, I continued reading Schaeffer's own books, which had come out by then. I think Os Guinness's first book, The Dust of Death, was out by then.
Okay.
And so I continued reading, and eventually became a Christian in the quiet hours at 4:00 in the morning one night.
Wow.
At 4:00 in the morning one night, I was wrestling with God and saying, you know what? I am actually intellectually convinced by now. I don't know all the answers. It'll take a lifetime to have all the answers, but I know enough to be intellectually convinced that it's true. And that was my conversion. That was, people say you can't. People say you don't have intellectual conversions. Well, I did. I had except that I'd seen L'Abri, of course, so that I'd seen a very different form of Christianity than most people. But when I actually made the decision, it was just 4:00 in the morning one night, wrestling with God and saying, okay, you won. I said, you won the argument.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay.
I love that.
You won the argument. You got it. But then I was not involved in a church or anything. And so I said, okay, where do I find other Christians? And the answer was, well, I knew some at L'Abri. So that's when I went back Sean, it was a year and a half later. A
Okay.
year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri in order to really get grounded in what did it mean to have a Christian worldview. What did it mean to be a Christian? Sort of across the board, not just apologetics, but personally and so on. And I was there for 4 months, which is
Okay.
about as long as most students were able to stay about 3 or 4 months because of immigration laws. You can stay on a.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
There's a visa. Most European
Yeah.
countries have a visa where you can stay for 3 months. And so that's how it
Okay.
happened at L'Abri. The vast majority of students came for 3 months, which is roughly
Got
a
it.
semester. That's how it worked. So they invited me to stay longer, but I decided it was time to go home and learn how to be a Christian in the real world again.
Hey, talk to me a little bit, if you can, how Francis Schaeffer shaped your thinking, because I consider you in many ways a modern day Francis Schaeffer, especially kind of the split view of truth. You've taken that idea and just articulated it so well. What was it about his thinking and his philosophy that has particularly shaped you?
Yeah, to be honest, for a while, when I was the first a Christian, I read his books almost until I could memorize them because
Wow.
it was so, I read them over and over again because it was so different. It was so new.
Hmm.
And then I went through a period. I don't know if you realize this, but many Christian academics were kind of down on Francis Schaeffer because he was not an academic.
Mm-hmm.
He was just a real live evangelist. He was asked once. I was at a conference once where he was asked, "Are you a theologian or a philosopher?" And he said, "Neither one. I'm an evangelist."
Interesting.
And isn't it? And that is very true. If you read his books, he's all about bringing people to a conversion experience. That is his overriding concern. And so he's looking at secular worldviews and analyzing them in order to overcome the barriers in people's minds to hearing the Christian message. That's his overriding concern was always to, and as he put it, he said, this is one of his favorite quotes, give honest answers to honest questions.
That's great.
And Christians weren't doing that. I mean, they still aren't to a large extent. Even today, people will say, if you come to a Christian leader with questions, they will say, do you have a moral problem? I was asked that many times. Is there really a moral problem lurking in the background? Is it really that you just want to party? I was asked this in a podcast not long ago.
Huh.
I was asked this in a podcast. Is it really that you just wanted to party on the weekends? Is that what was driving your so-called agnosticism? In other words, people were not taking seriously the idea that, hey, if you are raised in a secular culture and you are told by the adult world around you that this is, that these secular worldviews are true, of course you're going to believe them. You're going to sincerely believe these secular worldviews. And so Schaeffer was right. You have to deal with these secular worldviews that people have absorbed and not just dismiss them and say, well, you're really in rebellion. You're really in some kind of spiritual rebellion or moral rebellion. No, I didn't want to party on the weekends. I'm sorry. I was not attracted to that lifestyle. I just sincerely had questions about whether Christianity was true. So Schaeffer was, let me start with that in answer to your question. First of all, Schaeffer was the first Christian I ever met who acted as if my questions were valid.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Up until then, it was always, if nothing else, it was, why don't you have enough faith? You should have enough faith to overcome these questions. And so something's wrong with you, right? That was the message. Something's wrong with you. Whereas when I went to L'Abri, if anything, it was the opposite. It was, oh, cool, you've got really nice questions. Let's dig in. I'd never been treated as though, a person with questions was actually welcome. The person, by the way, the person who led, I told you it's Schaeffer, L'Abri had these small group discussion groups for people who were there for just short-term group. And the person who was leading it when I was there was Darrow Miller. So I have to do a shout out to Darrow Miller because he was he taught at L'Abri for several years. Darrow is Darrow, and then he went into international development. So he now talks about the importance of worldview in international development. You can't just throw money at development problems. You have to address people's worldview. So he was important because he was the person who said, "Hey, we've got an extra bed. Would you like to stay?" And who said, "Oh, I'm so glad you have questions. We have answers, so we're glad you have questions." So that was a beginning point. Is that Schaeffer was the first person, Schaeffer and his ministry were the first place I had ever encountered Christians who welcomed questions and weren't afraid of questions because they knew Christianity had answers. I think a lot of reason Christians often shame people for their questions because they really don't have answers, and so they're afraid of questions. And I'm sure you've run into this in your apologetics. Is that they're afraid of questions because they don't really have answers, and so they put it back on you and say something's wrong with you because you don't have enough faith. So you asked about Schaeffer. So that was the first thing.
Great.
The second thing was this. There was a period of time when I thought I'd kind of outgrown Schaeffer because, he was not an academic, and a lot of Christian academics spoke badly of Schaeffer. And I have to tell you, it was when I was writing a review of Phil Johnson's book. Phil Johnson is well known as a leader in the intelligent design movement. And I think it was his book, Reason and the Balance. And I was writing a review for a publication. And having been in the secular world of academia for so long, this is what Phil Johnson brought to us, by the way, for a later question that you're going to ask, is that having, he didn't convert until he was at late 30s, about 37, I think.
Okay.
And so he had lived in the secular worldview, and he had been chief clerk to a Supreme Court Justice, Warren, I believe, and he had been in the secular academic world, the University of California at Berkeley. So he understood the secular world, and he said in his book, the main problem that faces Christians is the fact-value split, that the concept of truth itself has been split apart. That in most civilizations, people have known that there's a natural order and a moral order, and that the two are integrated. There's one cosmic order that integrates them both, and therefore truth is also an integrated system. Truth will be an integrated whole. And it's really only in the modern world, since the rise of modern science, that people began to say, well, no, really the only reliable knowledge we have is of science, is of empirically testable facts. Well, what does that mean then for things like morality or theology? They cannot be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. And so many people began to say, well, they don't really qualify as truths. They are merely personal preference, personal opinion, your own private experience, what makes you feel better, what helps you get through the night. And when I was doing this review of Phil Johnson's work on the fact-value split, that gave me the language to finally say, oh, wow, that is what Schaeffer was talking about. He was talking about it before we had the language, the labels of facts and values, because he never used those labels. And it was when I was reading Phil Johnson, and who was steeped in secular philosophy, and who was writing. Phil Johnson was writing about how Darwinism has essentially cemented this the fact realm, right? Because now the fact realm is completely non-supernatural. There's no need for a God to describe the natural worlds, including biology, including the origin of life, and so on. And so he was talking about the function that Darwinism had served in cementing the fact-value split, because it had essentially said the fact realm now is comprehensive enough to explain all of reality. And therefore, anything that you put in the value realm, to use the fact-value language, anything you put in the value realm is not really true, is not really factual. It's just your personal values, which was identified with what it really came from the verb, what you personally value, what's important to you.
Yep.
So it was very subjective, very relativistic. And Schaeffer had used a little diagram that was very helpful to people. And he wasn't the first person to use this. He got this because he was living in Europe, and a lot of European philosophers were already using this diagram. That was something that Christians didn't realize. They thought this was some idiosyncratic thing that Schaeffer thought of, but it wasn't. It's very common among European philosophers. He used it for the fact-value split, though he didn't use that language. He used the metaphor of two stories in a building.
Uh-huh.
So the lower story was the realm of facts and what we know by science, and the upper story was the realm of values, which is morality, theology, and so on. And when you say what was one of the main themes that I got from Schaeffer, that turned out to be perhaps the most important theme that I got from Schaeffer, was that the concept of truth has been split. And the reason that Christians are having trouble communicating with the secular world is because the secular world has put them in that upper story, to use this two-story metaphor, or the value realm, to use the fact-value split. Facts are in the lower story, values are in the upper story. Christianity has been put in the upper story, where it's really not about truth. It's about your personal feelings, what makes you feel better. And so when you talk about Christianity to a non-Christian, you intend to be communicating universal, objective truth. They hear you, but in their mind, my students say this is the matrix. Once they finally get this upper-lower story divide, they say this is the matrix, because so many people think this way and they don't even know it.
That's right.
So when you make a claim about Christian truth, they don't hear it as a claim about Christian truth. They immediately, non-reflectively, in a knee-jerk reaction, they put it in the upper story and think that you're giving them your personal preference, your personal feelings. And so because Schaeffer, because he was primarily an evangelist, that was his main concern, is that we can no longer even communicate claims of Christian truth without being misunderstood. And that we, in a sense, have to go through a two-step process. We have to explain what we mean by truth, and then explain how Christianity is true. And again, because you want this to be personalized, that's what happened to me when I went to L'Abri. That was exactly it. I was so steeped in relativism and skepticism that I did go through that two-step process. I first had to be convinced that there was such a thing as objective truth.
Wow.
Before I could even consider whether Christianity was that truth. So is that, when you say what's the most important thing I got from Lewis and I'm this fall I'm teaching a course on Lewis and Schaeffer, so I'm constantly thinking
great.
Lewis and Schaeffer. But yeah, the main thing I got from Schaeffer was that the concept of truth itself has been split apart.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And I've seen that in your book, Total Truth, which I love. I've got your book, Love Thy Body, right here, which is in my top 5 recommendations, even with high school students. I took a group of high school students through it a year ago, about a dozen. And I think it just explains that, especially now with gender and biological sex, we're seeing that split even greater. So that makes sense. Walk me through, after leaving L'Abri, what was a decision for you to become an apologist, become a thinker? Was it just obvious you wanted to do it right away? Did you decide at some point, I want to be a professor, want to write, want to speak? What was that journey like for you?
Well, the latter. There was no decision.
Okay.
There was no decision. There was just, you have to do what God has equipped you for. I'm talking to some of my students about this right now, so it's on my mind. I'm trying to persuade them that they have a life message. They have a life message. I have a student who didn't convert until she was 37. She has a law degree. She works for the city government. She's very high ranking. But she feels like a newborn in terms of her Christianity. which is true, but it's time for her to start thinking about, but what is your life message? I do believe for all of my students, God has given them a life message, and that's what they need to find. For me, there was just no question about it. I was so driven. Sean, I was so driven. I'm still driven.
Yes, you are.
I was so driven to find truth. After here's the maybe here's the larger answer. After being at L'Abri, and with the second time, which was a year and a half later, and I had become a Christian, I have to tell you, I continued reading books on apologetics because I was afraid I'd just done something really stupid. Becoming a
Sure.
that is becoming
Sure.
a Christian. I was afraid I had maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I had done something stupid. I was second guessing my decision to become a Christian constantly. And so for a long time, for years, I was still reading mostly philosophy and apologetics to be really, really sure that Christianity was true. So again, this wasn't an academic interest. This was very much driven by my own need to find truth and to make sure that even though I had become a Christian, I still needed to search and confirm that Christianity was true, that you could make a good reasoned argument for it, and so on. So for all that to say that for several years, there was no decision about this. It was an internal drive to know. And then it seemed most logical that I got married to a man who wanted to attend seminary. And well, that makes sense. That makes total sense. I'll do that. I'll attend seminary with him. So that's how I got my MA degree.
Oh, that's great.
And then he knew of a Christian graduate school in Toronto, Canada, called the Institute for Christian Studies, which I don't particularly recommend anymore because it's gone so liberal.
Okay.
But it was great at the time. About half the professors at the time were still biblical and orthodox, and it had the same philosophical roots that Schaeffer had. When I say that Schaeffer understood the fact value split before Americans did, it's because he was living in Europe. And there was a Dutch philosopher who was a Christian whose name was Herman Dooyeweerd. Dooye, D-O-O, you know this name, D-O-O-Y-E-W-E-E-R-D. So that the double vowels is very Dutch. But Dooyeweerd was the first systematic. He was the first. You have to realize he was the first systematic Protestant philosopher. So we've had a lot of philosophy professors, historians of philosophy. But in terms of somebody who said, hey, I'm going to construct what I think is a biblical philosophy, Dooyeweerd is the only one we have as Protestants. And he's worth knowing for that reason alone. And he was the one who influenced Schaeffer then.
Gotcha.
So
that makes sense.
So if you read Schaeffer and then you would read Dooyeweerd, you say, okay, Schaeffer was sort of the popularized version of Dooyeweerd.
Oh, that's good to know. I didn't know that.
So if you want to go beyond Schaeffer and say,
okay.
well, where did you asked me where I went intellectually after L'Abri. Well, I kept saying, where did Schaeffer get this? Where did he get this? I want to know the sources. I want to go back behind Schaeffer and find out where he got this stuff. And a lot of people didn't do that. But Dooyeweerd was one of his most important sources. And Dooyeweerd was the inspiration for this Christian graduate school in Toronto. So there's the connection. So by going to Toronto, we were able to dig more deeply into Dooyeweerd's thought, which was therefore digging into the sources of Schaeffer's thought.
That makes sense,
doesn't it? Yeah. So it's actually called, Dooyeweerd's philosophy is called Reformational philosophy because they were in a sense trying to go back to the Reformation. you remember the Reformation was about saying, okay, medieval Christian thought was largely dominated by Greek philosophy. When the early church said, hey, we've got a new theology, but how do we express it philosophically? Many of them picked up Neoplatonism was the most popular philosophy through the Middle Ages. And then, then Aquinas, in the days of Aquinas, Aristotle was being rediscovered. So Aquinas, in a sense, Christianizes Aristotle. And then the Reformation comes along and says, why are you guys connecting Christianity to these pagan philosophies, right? Don't we have a truly biblical philosophy? So that's been in a sense, that's been the goal of Protestants all along. Unfortunately, they didn't really succeed. After the Reformation, they went back to teaching scholasticism in the Protestant universities. But that was the goal, and that's what Doriward's goal was. So he was writing in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Interesting.
And he was trying to recover that goal. He was trying to recover, is there a distinctively biblical philosophy, or do we have to rely, like the Middle Ages did, on Plato and Aristotle? I mean, isn't there a biblical philosophy? And that's what he was trying to do. I have to tell you, in many ways, then he was like all of us. He was still a child of his times, and so he kind of a lot of his influence were phenomenology, for example.
Oh, gotcha.
And a lot of Catholic thinkers are influenced by phenomenology. A lot of them think that of all the isms out there, that phenomenology is perhaps the most compatible with Christianity. Secular phenomenologists have complained about what they call the theological turn. That's the term they've used. The theological turn within phenomenology, because there are so many Christians who are phenomenologists and who are interpreting it within a Christian perspective. So Doriward would fall into that category to some degree, just as a heads up. But that was what that's what we did when we went to Toronto. It was called the Institute for Christian Studies. It was an offshoot of the Free University of Amsterdam, which Doriward had started. And so it taught this Doriwardian philosophy, which was, in a sense, the metaphysics behind what Schaeffer said.
Gotcha.
So that's how I went further.
That's super fascinating. I had no idea that was his connection. I've read some of his stuff, seen him cited, but that makes a lot of sense of the thinking behind him. I have a bunch of questions for you, but one I'm curious about is, as a female apologist, have you faced what you think are some just kind of unique challenges in that apologetics has pretty much been dominated mostly by men? Has that given you advantages, been more difficult? What's been that like for you?
Oh, it's definitely more difficult. Yeah. No doubt about it. It's definitely more difficult. But Sean, there's actually another problem, and that is I don't have a PhD. I have never had the time or the money to take time off from writing. There's all my books behind me.
I know, that's awesome.
I've never been able to take time off from writing. Okay. So I have to be honest, I'd have to say it was twofold.
Okay.
In the academic world, as you well know, because I know you went back and got your PhD, it is harder if you don't have a PhD. I did. I'm very, very grateful that HBU, I teach now at Houston Baptist University, and I'm very grateful that they were willing to essentially take my books as a substitute for a PhD. Every book is at least one dissertation, right?
Absolutely.
They really are.
Yeah.
But in spite of that, I tried to get jobs at Christian universities because I'm a teacher at heart. I love to teach.
Yeah.
My writing's all teaching, as you can tell.
Totally.
That's been my writing has been my main form of teaching. So I have tried to get jobs at Christian universities, and because PhDs are so common, as you probably know, because you get a PhD, there's so many unemployed or underemployed PhDs these days.
Yeah.
So even tiny Christian colleges won't even look at you without a PhD.
Hmm.
So I'm very deeply grateful that HBU, it was when John Mark Reynolds was the provost, so I have to give him credit. John Mark Reynolds wanted to start a program in cultural apologetics. And you probably know this, but HBU is the only Christian university that has a degree program in cultural apologetics.
Yeah.
There are other universities like Biola that have courses in cultural apologetics, but there's and I think Union, maybe some other universities,
Sure.
but this is the only Christian university that has a degree program in cultural apologetics. And John Mark Reynolds, it was my book. Well, I'll hold it up. It was my
Do
book,
it.
Saving Leonardo.
It's
It was this
great.
book,
Great book.
Saving Leonardo, which talks about how intellectual history, how the history of ideas percolates down through the arts. And since we were talking about Schaeffer, I'll add this: the term cultural apologetics was first coined to describe what Schaeffer did, and a lot of people don't know that.
Hmm.
But Schaeffer was the first person to say, apologetics doesn't need to be these abstract arguments floating around in the ether, even though those are good, of course. But he said apologetics can also be looking at how ideas percolate down to ordinary people through cultural means, through art and literature and music, movies, advertisements, the whole shebang. And so because that was new, nobody had done that before. And so because he was looking at how ideas percolate down through the culture, it was termed cultural apologetics.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where the term came from. And so, I mean, there are people who don't know the history. There are people who think, for example, I've run into people who think cultural apologetics means learning how to write Narnia stories like Lewis did, because that's literature, right? So that's culture.
Sure.
So it's important to note that the term cultural apologetics, which is what we're trying to do here at Houston Baptist, came from Schaeffer. It was his form of ministry, where it was wonderful. I mean, again, back to my time at L'Abri, this was really impressive that he was able to bring together the cognitive, in other words, the philosophical ideas and arguments with the arts, with art and literature and even movies and so on, so that he was addressing the whole person, the cognitive and the creative. And that's what I love about cultural apologetics that he pioneered, is that it involves the whole person. And so that people who come, like my students who come to the program, you don't just get built up in one area, you get built up across the board. So anyway, so that's
great.
That's what we do at HBU. Oh, your question was, I'm thinking back to your question now. So yes, so HBU was the only Christian college that was willing to say, hey, you qualify for your books.
Gotcha.
If you talk about an artist in residence or a writer in residence, they're not hired for having their PhDs. They're hired for what they can do.
Yep.
And so that's essentially how HBU decided to treat my position. You're hired for what you can do. And so that made a big difference, that I have, all of my books have reached bestseller status in terms of the number of volumes sold. And so HBU was willing to say, okay, fine, you are doing cultural apologetics.
Love it.
And so, we're going to hire you for this position.
That's awesome. That makes sense. Well, I love that you're doing that at HBU. Cultural apologetics is so important. So it sounds like you found a good home. A question for you I've got is, do you have a favorite biblical book that you just go to and you enjoy the most?
Well, you're going to laugh. My favorite book is Habakkuk.
Okay. I love it. Tell me why.
And I will give you the reason, because, it ties back to L'Abri again. When I went to L'Abri, as an agnostic and had a lot of intellectual questions. There were also emotional issues. And on staff at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and she was affectionately called Birdie. And she realized that for many people, their objections to Christianity were not just intellectual, but also emotional, especially if they grew up in a Christian home that they were reacting against. And of course, this is primarily true of pastors' kids and missionary kids. Sheila Birdie grew up as a missionary kid, so she was very aware of this. And she too went through a period of being a non-Christian, and before coming back. So she agreed when L'Abri asked her to come on staff. She agreed because she knew that you needed both. You needed both the intellectual message and the arguments, and the emotional, psychological issues. And I had grown up in a severely abusive home.
Oh, wow.
Right. And I'm starting to say it publicly these days. It took a long time. As long as my father was still alive, I didn't say it publicly.
I understand.
He died a few years ago, and he was severely abusive, not just a little bit, like punching us.
I'm so sorry.
Closed fist punching was his favorite. Was his favorite way of hitting us. And so that was another. I did have very strong emotional objections to Christianity because my parents claimed to be Christians, and I thought, I don't want that form of Christianity. That's not something I want. That's something I want to leave behind. When I moved away from home after high school, I wanted to leave everything behind that I had known as a child. I wanted to start over with a clean slate. I wanted to rebuild my whole life. Of course, you can't do that. Birdie showed me you can't do that. You actually have to work through the issues of your childhood. So but this is good. At age 19, seeing Birdie it was really more my second trip to L'Abri. My second trip to L'Abri, I was there 4 months. So I saw, I said originally that I went to L'Abri because I had some family members there. It was my parents. So Birdie saw my father. Wow. And she told me when she saw my father, her response was, there's a man who oppresses everyone around him.
Wow.
She could see it. And therefore she began praying for me. I hadn't even decided to go see her yet, right? Because I didn't know she existed. She started praying for me when she saw my father, because she knew I would have father issues. And the first time I went to see her, I was still an agnostic. And she said, I knew you were coming. God always tells me who's going to come see me. Because, of course, she couldn't see every student who came through L'Abri, right? There's too many. And so she told me God would tell her who was going to come see her. And so God had told her I was going to come, and she'd seen my father. So all that to say, what was your somehow this tied back to your original question.
It was about Habakkuk and your favorite biblical book.
Thank you. So my first several years as a Christian, I read Apologetics and Suffering. I read books on apologetics, as I said earlier, because I still felt like I needed to really get grounded on suffering. I had to come to grips with how did Christianity address the problem of suffering.
Wow.
And I read a lot of books on emotional healing, books on Christianity and psychology and so on. But I read Solzhenitsyn, I read books, Solzhenitsyn's all 3 volumes.
Wow.
I read, because I wanted to know, how do people survive suffering? That was my biggest practical question as a Christian. How do people survive suffering? And I read a lot of prison memoirs. You may know some of the others, like there's a book called The Vietnamese Gulag by a Vietnamese person who was put into a Gulag style prison after when the North Vietnamese came in, when the communists came in and took over South Vietnam. There's a book called Against All Hope by Armando Valladares, I think is his name. He's a poet and a Catholic, and he was put into Cuba's prisons. He writes
Yeah.
he writes very eloquently about
Mm.
the years he spent in Castro's prisons. It's called Against All Hope. All that to say, to give you an idea of the uplifting literature I was reading. uh, but that's I have found that many Christians don't really face the problem of suffering sometimes until later in their Christian life, when some crisis
Mm.
happens. And so I have discovered that this was somewhat unusual. That as soon as I became a Christian, I just dove into questions to books and literature on suffering. Habakkuk, the end of the book of Habakkuk says, if this, now I haven't read it for a little while here, so I don't have it memorized word for word, but remember the book, in the book, he challenges God, and he says, why are you bringing the Babylonians to conquer your people? I mean, these are your people. Why are you doing this? And he says, I'm going to stand on the ramparts and ask God until God tells me the answer. And basically God says, yeah, well, I sometimes use secular people, or back then it would be pagan, not secular.
Sure.
I use pagan people, to chastise my people. I do that. And but as soon as they've accomplished that, of course I'm going to chastise them too. They're not going to get away with it. But I do use suffering to chastise my people. And so Habakkuk is reconciled to it as a result. And at the end, remember, he says, though the figs don't grow on the trees, and though the crops don't grow in the fields, though we don't have animals in our pens, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Yet, and even though everything goes bad, even though there's a lot of suffering and deprivation, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. So actually, that is my favorite book of the Bible.
That makes sense. That's beautiful. Can I ask, what was it, as you were reading so much stuff on suffering, about the Christian worldview that made you find the Christian worldview plausible? So I know it answered some of the philosophical questions about objective morality and truth, etc. But what was it in terms of its approach to suffering and evil that made sense to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sean. A lot of it comes down, let me refer back to, wasn't it Lewis? Lewis, who says, we're fighting a battle. We're fighting a battle. And there are times when it will look like we're on the losing side. There will even be times when it looks like the supreme commander is not even on our side, right? In other words, it looks like God's not on my side. And Lewis uses the analogy of you're in a battle, and sometimes it may look like the supreme commander is not really doing it. He seems to be helping the enemy, not you. And he says, in those times, we have to trust what we do know about the commander. In other words, it's not blind faith, because we do know a lot about the commander. We do know a lot about God. All of that background in philosophy and science. Science was a big part too. Sean, we haven't even touched on that, but I wrote for 13 years for a creationist organization. That was my first writing job. And I wrote, it was fun. I first wrote for children. They had a little science reader that was for children. Yeah. I recommend this for anyone who wants to become a writer. Learn to write for children first.
That's a great advice.
You find out all of the things that you think you know, but when you really, you use an abstract term of some kind. And if somebody says, yeah, but what does that really mean? You find out that it's very difficult to unpack it and take it apart. And for children, of course, you have to do that. So it was kind of like did you ever, you're so young, you might not have grown up on these, but I grew up on weekly readers. Did you have weekly readers?
I don't recall the weekly readers.
This was an attempt to get young students to read newspapers, So when I was young, there was this thing called weekly readers, and they were like little newspapers for elementary school kids. So this was kind of a weekly reader on science, just on science. And it was put out by the Bible Science Association. So I started writing for first through third grade, and then second, and then fourth through sixth grade, and then junior high, and then high school, and then finally I was writing for their adult newsletter. And I was writing, 4 to 5,000 word backgrounders for the adult newsletter. So
Yeah.
these were quite substantial. And over time, I talked them into letting me write on worldview issues, not just science. In other words, my prime example would be, say, somebody like John Dewey, who's considered, the father of American education because he had so much influence. But he was a very committed Darwinian, and his theory of how the mind learns, how children learn, was modeled on Darwinian evolution. So he said, an organism evolves when it encounters a challenge in its environment, and so it evolves an adaptation to the environment. And he said the same thing in education. You put a problem in front of the kid and you let them evolve an adaptation, a problem-solving strategy to deal with it. And so there's really not a question of true or false. It's just, is that a viable strategy for dealing with the, with this particular intellectual challenge? And so it's inherently relativistic. But if you don't know that, you don't understand Dewey. Dewey was a Darwinian through and through.
Yeah.
All that to say, so I had 13 years writing on these issues, on science. And so even when I had doubts, I think we'll all be set by doubts at times. God doesn't come through on a prayer that we've prayed very devoutly, oh, we really, really want this, and God doesn't come through. I think we're all challenged by doubts at times, but I have to tell you, after writing for 13 years on science, I knew that whatever emotional doubts I had, there's no secular worldview that answers the questions that from science in particular, philosophy as well. But after 13 years of writing on science, that was kind of my intellectual stronghold. So that anytime I had emotional doubts or questions, I knew Christianity was true. I knew there were no secular worldviews that answered the questions the way that Christianity does. So it was a combination of the philosophical arguments from Labrie as well as the scientific arguments. So I've forgotten your question again. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm trying to get inside your thinking and your life, so you're doing awesome. It was about, what was it about the evil and suffering in the Christian worldview? And you started with Lewis, how he would say in these battles, it feels like we're losing, but I have enough confidence that we're winning. So it sounds like, if I heard you right, you were saying there was evidence that Christianity was true as a whole and the basis to put trust in God, even when you didn't know particular reasons for things that happened. Is that fair?
Oh, that's excellent. That's an excellent summary. Exactly. So between the philosophical arguments that I'd sort of worked through at Labrie and the scientific arguments that I'd worked through for all these years working for the Bible Science Association, which, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. When emotional issues arose connected to suffering, why is my life so bad? Why am I so unhappy? Why are things not working out? There was a big contrast between this beautiful truth that I knew of Christianity. It was beautiful, right? Compared to secular worldviews, Christianity is very positive. It says that humans have, great value and dignity. It says that there's, like you said, ultimately good is going to win out. It's beautiful, as well as convincing. But my life wasn't beautiful. When my life was such a mess, I had this beautiful system over here, system of thought and theology and doctrine, and then my life was such a mess. What kept me going is, as you said, is knowing Christianity was true, that there were good reasons for it. Intellectually, I could not deny it. And I think this is a good example of where, when you're intellectually convinced, that is your stronghold. When your emotions go up and down,
Amen.
When you know that it's true, that will keep you stable.
That's a great word. I've got so many questions for you, but I also want to respect your time for coming on. So maybe we'll do a follow-up at some point. But I want to encourage you if I can. Thanks for sharing. You said publicly you've been sharing recently about the abuse hadn't for years. My dad grew up with a different kind of abuse from his dad. It was very pretty, not from his dad and his family, severe sexual abuse. And about, I don't know, a dozen years ago, he sat us down as a family and shared that he was going to share it publicly. And the amount of people that have been ministered to by his willingness to share that absolutely just blows me away. So I think it's powerful to have somebody so committed to truth like you are from the get-go. You wanted to know truth. What keeps you grounded is truth. To share that, Labrie, it was the love and the relationship, and your heart was like, I just want a life that is true and gives me satisfaction and meaning, and I just want to feel better, make sense of this pain. That is so powerful and just well-rounded that from where I'm sit, for what it's worth, I'd encourage you to incorporate that in when you get the chance to speak. There's a couple comments just about how powerful that was that you shared that. So thanks for doing that. I want to encourage, all your books are awesome. They're behind you. In particular, I can't even say favorite because I love Total Truth, but Love Thy Body. Again, if anybody watching this has not read Love Thy Body, it's a must. It's a roadmap, especially with LGBTQ issues today. It will just help you see things with clarity that I think are often missing. So hope people will pick that up. And if you want to study cultural apologetics, you're right. We have a class at Biola, but if you want to go in depth, and sometimes John Mark Reynolds will come teach that class for us. But if you want a full degree on cultural apologetics, check out HBU. So we consider, again, HBU a sister school. We're in partnership. We need as many people doing and training this as possible. So really grateful for what you do. Thank you, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Sean. Those were wonderful questions, and I don't often get an opportunity to talk about my own experience. So this was very special. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for doing that. Very quick to our viewers here. Make sure you hit subscribe because we have some interviews coming up you are not going to want to miss. We're going behind the scenes with Wayne Grudem, with Craig Keener, interestingly enough. Next Friday, we have Craig Evans coming on to talk about the new Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. And some of the stuff he has to say is fascinating. And then I've just had an agreement from a progressive Christian to come on. We're not going to debate, but have a conversation about the differences between evangelical Christianity and progressive Christianity. The goal is just to model a healthy civil conversation, highlight the similarities and also some of the stark differences. So if you're new to the channel, brought to you by Biola Apologetics, make sure you hit subscribe, notification button. You're not going to miss stuff we have coming up. Pick up Love Thy Body. Nancy, don't disappear yet. Hang in there. But thanks so much for everybody for joining us today.